Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. I like to be very honest with you, I was not expecting much from this game, but I was completely wrong. When I played the game for the very first time today, I was really surprised. In terms of gameplay, in terms of visuals, in terms of the picture quality in general, this game is really good. And the best thing is, the HDR implementation in this game is on a very high level. Okay, so where should we start? So the HDR implementation in this game is really on a great level in my opinion. The picture is not too dark. Even you play this game on an OLED TV like the G2 here with HDR enabled. Specular highlights are really popping, very vivid colors. So in general, HDR in this game is, so far one of my candidates for Best HDR Implementation 2023. In this video I'm talking about the PlayStation 5 version and the Xbox Series version. Unfortunately, I do not have a code or a version from the PC. So that means I can just assume that my settings, what I'm going to provide you, also fitting for the PC. So you can do me a big favor. If you try my settings and you're playing on the PC, then just put in a comment section if you like them or not. So let's start talking about the bad news. And the bad news is this game does not support the HDR system level calibration on the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. And again, I'm assuming the same counts for the PC version. But that's not a problem at all because we have really good working, very nice working HDR settings actually in the game. And before we talking about the HDR settings, let's talk about something else. HDR black level rays. Do we have this issue in this game? And I have to say, unfortunately, yes, very minor. Actually, so minor it's not worth to talk about. But if you like to get rid of the HDR black level rays, then all what you have to do is to change your brightness by one click. So decrease the brightness setting by one click, at least on my LG ZX and on the G2. It was enough to get rid of the very minor HDR black level rays. And by the way, I tested this on the PlayStation 5 in HDR10 and also on the Xbox Series in HDR10 and Dolby Vision. The HDR black level rays or Dolby Vision black level rays is the same in HDR10 or Dolby Vision. But again, in my opinion, very minor. Not even worth to talk about it. And before this comes up in the comment section, I know the game looks washed out in the very beginning, but I think this is done on purpose because if you look very closely, you can see a lot of smoke because the plane crashed and there's a lot of smoke and fire, and of course this makes the game or the look actually a little bit washed out. So in my opinion, this is done on purpose because when you look very closely in very dark corners or areas, then you can see there's almost no problem with HDR black level rays. Let's talk about the HDR settings in the game, and the very first thing what you should check is HDR actually enabled? And on the next screen we have a couple of sliders and options actually, like calibrate white point, calibrate black point brightness and user interface brightness. So let's start with the black point calibration, and after my testing I couldn't find any reason to increase this value. Standard factory setting is 0 and I would strongly recommend to leave it at 0. The next one is the white point calibration, and I will share my recommended settings with you in a second. This one is responsible for the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. The next setting what we have is the brightness setting, and this setting is responsible for the general or overall brightness in the game. Standard factory setting is 25 and I found this actually a very good value to start with. I wouldn't increase or decrease this value too much because either you get black level crush or you have a very washed out picture. And then last but not least we have the UI, the user interface brightness, and this setting as always is absolutely up to you. If you like to have a very bright user interface, then increase it. If you like to have a very dark user interface, then just change it to 0. Every time when we have a brightness setting in a HDR game, then we have to answer a very important question. Does this brightness setting affect the HDR maximum peak brightness in specular highlights? And in the case of Dead Island 2, the brightness setting is actually affecting the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights, but actually on a very low level. So when you leave the calibrate white point setting at 1000, I found that the maximum peak brightness and specular highlights is around 880-900 candela, which is a little bit too low because we're setting it actually to 1000. But what I found is when you now decrease the brightness setting from 25 to 0, you already lose 100 nits, around 100 nits roughly. But when you increase it from 25 to 100, you actually gain around, let's say, 50 nits. So you can see it's not very much of an impact, but you need to consider this. And now let's talk about the maximum peak brightness of specular highlights in combination or depending on the calibrated white point setting, because what I found is, and if you were listening closely, you found it already because I told you already 1000 nits. When I set the game to 1000 nits, I measured around 880-900 nits in the game or in specular highlights. So this doesn't match up. And the same counts actually when you set the calibrate white point to 2000. Then I found the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights is just around 1600. And that's why you should never trust HDR in-game settings in games, because if you would follow the instruction and if you would set up the symbol until you barely can't see it, then you would have a too low maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. Okay, so let's talk about my recommended settings for this game, and I hope the Excel sheet what I prepared is clear enough. So I confirmed, of course, my settings for the LG CX, the LG G2. Please keep in mind, I don't have any TV with a maximum peak brightness of around 1300 nits like the G3 or the S95C. Also a TV with 1500 nits I don't own anymore. My QN95B is gone. And the maximum peak brightness, if you need it, is 1600 nits when you set the HDR white point to 2000. And because I played the game on the Xbox Series X as well, I did also a little bit of testing with Dolby Vision. And as always, Dolby Vision requires actually slightly higher settings compared to HDR10. So this is not because the maximum peak brightness in Dolby Vision is higher compared to HDR10. This is how the LG TV is actually handling Dolby Vision compared to HDR10. And I have to say, Dolby Vision gaming mode is completely wrong out of the box on any LG TV if you haven't professional calibrated them. But as always, it's absolutely up to you if you like to play this game in HDR10 or Dolby Vision. The only thing what I would strongly recommend is leave the black point setting at 0. And when we're now talking about the brightness setting, then please keep in mind this is in combination with HDRG enabled on my OLED TVs. I found the standard factory setting of 25 really good. Very bright, not too dark at all. Actually, in some locations or occasions, very bright actually, almost too bright. So this game is really made for HDRG in my opinion with the proper settings. And last but not least, user interface brightness is as always absolutely up to you. And now let's talk about HDR10 versus Dolby Vision, or to be more precise, HDRG versus dynamic tone mapping off versus dynamic tone mapping on versus Dolby Vision. So what did I find the best after some testing? And I have a very clear answer. It is HDRG. I like how HDRG is actually handling the game. It is not too dark, not at all. I mean, look at this. This is sometimes even a little bit too bright in my opinion. So it is just a great experience. HDRG, the HDRG picture is very impactful in Dead Island 2. Dolby Vision, on the other hand, is very similar to HDRG, with the only difference that, the picture actually looks a little bit more bright and sometimes a little bit washed out because the EOTF curve on uncalibrated OLED TVs like the LG CX or G2 in the Dolby Vision gaming mode is just not accurate at all. It is just overbrighten the whole picture. But if you like this, then go with Dolby Vision, because it is at the end, in terms of how it shows maximum or how it shows specular highlights in terms of maximum peak brightness, it is very similar to HDRG. When it comes to dynamic tone mapping off, there's just one thing to say. Please do not use it, because you will have just a very bad HDR experience in this game. Dynamic tone mapping on can give you a higher average picture brightness compared to HDRG, but there is actually no need to use this on an LG OLED TV, because if you like to have a little bit more brightness, then just increase the brightness slider and you're good to go. The biggest downside from dynamic tone mapping on is that it will clip specular highlights compared to HDR. So that means HDR will provide more details in very bright objects compared to dynamic tone mapping on, due to the fact how dynamic tone mapping on is actually handling HDR content. Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video. I say thank you very much for watching me, and I hope that my settings or my recommended settings what I provided are actually fitting your TV. So please put in the comment section what you think about my settings, and maybe you have a different opinion. So I'm happy actually to learn. I'm happy to change my settings if there are better ones out there. In my opinion, this game has really a great HDR implementation, especially with HDR enabled. HDR is impactful, colorful, and yeah, I have to say, and yeah, this is not the type of the video actually, because I will do a performance test from the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series soon, but I have to mention it, the picture quality in terms of how clean the picture is, this is really, really great. I really do enjoy playing this game in such a great quality. Thank you very much, and yeah, I see you guys next time. Bye.